pleased to be here, and I want to thank both the universities that have sponsored me and the various publishers who have brought out my works in recent days and years. I'm especially grateful to Athena. Sometimes one finds a reader who reads one better than one could possibly read oneself. I'm very moved and honored and dispossessed by her elegant introduction. Thank you. I am guessing that although I believe gender trouble just appeared in Greek yesterday, that most of you know my work on gender by one route or another, some of which was written more than 20 years ago. So I thought I might take this opportunity to think again about gender performativity and to try to give an account of how I moved from a focus on performativity to a more general concern with precarity. Performativity was, to be sure, an account of agency, and precarity seems to focus on conditions that threaten life in ways that appear to be outside of one's control. Are these two concepts as different as they might at first appear? To conduct this comparison, or to describe this passage, let me briefly review what is meant by gender performativity and also what is meant by precarity. And then let me try and explain what has prompted me to change my focus to some degree, but also to point out what has not changed. To say that gender is performative is to say that it is a certain kind of enactment. The appearance of gender is often mistaken as a sign of its internal or inherent truth. Gender is prompted by obligatory norms to be one gender or the other, usually within a strictly binary frame, and the reproduction of gender is thus always a negotiation with power. So finally, there is no gender without this reproduction of norms that risks undoing or redoing the norm in unexpected ways, thus opening up the possibility of a remaking of gendered reality along new lines. Precarity, on the other hand, describes a few different conditions that pertain to living beings. Anything living can be expunged at will or by accident, and its persistence is in no sense guaranteed. As a result, social and political institutions are designed, in part, to minimize conditions of precarity, especially within the nation state, although, as you will see, I consider this restriction a problem. Political orders, including economic and social institutions, are to some extent designed to address those very needs, not only to make sure that housing and food are available, but that populations have the means available by which life can be secured. And yet, precarity designates that politically induced condition in which certain populations suffer from failing social and economic networks of support and become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death. Such populations are at heightened risk of disease, poverty, starvation, displacement, and of exposure to violence without protection. Precarity thus also characterizes that politically induced condition of maximized vulnerability and exposure for populations subject to arbitrary state violence and to other forms of aggression that are not enacted by states and against which states do not offer adequate protection. So by precarity, we may be talking about populations that starve or who near starvation, but we might also be talking about sex workers who have to defend themselves against both street violence and police harassment. Precarity is, of course, directly linked with gender norms, since we know that those who do not live their genders in intelligible ways are at heightened risk for harassment and violence. Gender norms have everything to do with how and in what way we can appear in public space, how and in what way the public and private are distinguished, and how that distinction is instrumentalized in the service of sexual politics. Who will be criminalized on the basis of public appearance? Who will fail to be protected by the law, or more specifically, the police, on the street, or on the job, or in the home? Who will be stigmatized? Who will be the object of fascination and consumer pleasure? Who will have medical benefits before the law? Whose intimate and kinship relations will in fact be recognized by the law? We know these questions from transgender activism, from feminism, from queer kinship politics, and also from the gay marriage movement and the issues raised by sex workers for public safety and economic enfranchisement. So these norms are not only instances of power, and they do not only reflect broader relations of power, they are one way that power operates. After all, power cannot stay in power without reproducing itself in some way. And every act of reproduction risks going awry or adrift or producing effects that are not fully foreseen. It is in this way, I would suggest, that a Derridian notion of iterability enters into a Marxist conception of the reproduction of domination, and indeed the reproduction of personhood, an important part of materialism according to the Marx of the German ideology. So when I speak about the subject in such contexts, it's not a subject who is the sovereign precondition of action and thought. It is rather a socially produced agent and deliberator whose agency and thought is made possible by a language that precedes that I. In this sense, the I is produced through power, though not the deterministic effect of power. Power relies on a mechanism of reproduction that can and does go awry, that can and does undo, that can undo the strategies of animating power and produce new and even subversive effects. The paradox or quandary that emerges from this situation is one that we find in politics all the time. If the terms of power lay out who can be a subject, who qualifies as a subject of recognition in politics or before the law, then the subject is not a precondition of politics, but a differential effect of power. It means as well that we can and must ask the question, who comes after the subject, not expecting another form of the subject to emerge in historical time, but because some name must be reserved for those who do not count as subjects, who do not sufficiently conform to the norms that confer recognizability on subjects. What do we call those who do not and cannot appear as subjects within hegemonic discourse? It seems to me that there are sexual and gender norms that in some ways condition what and who will be legible and what and who will not. And we have to be able to take into account this differential allocation of recognizability. It seems that we must do this in order to understand those forms of living gender that are misrecognized or remain unrecognizable precisely because they exist at the limits of established norms for thinking embodiment and even personhood? Are there, for instance, forms of sexuality for which there is no good vocabulary precisely because the powerful logics that determine how we think about desire, orientation, sexual acts, and pleasures do not admit of certain modes of sexuality? The difference between a structuralism, even a structuralist psychoanalysis, and a post-structuralism embedded in the dynamics of power is that the former would simply dismiss all claims of recognition as impossible and make of that a timeless pathos or a perennial joke, but the latter would have to ask why some forms of sexual life are so much more possible than others, and why some seem to embody the unthinkable and even the unlivable. The performativity of gender is thus bound up with the differential ways in which subjects become eligible for recognition. Although, of course, I accept that full recognition is never fully possible, I also accept that there are differential ways of allocating recognizability. The desire for recognition can never be fulfilled. Yes, that is true. But to be a subject at all requires first complying with certain norms that govern recognition to make a person recognizable. And so, non-compliance calls into question the viability of one's life, the ontological conditions of one's persistence. We think of subjects as the kinds of beings who ask for recognition in the law or in political life. But perhaps the more important issue is how the terms of recognition, and here we can include a number of gender and sexual norms, condition in advance who will count as a subject and who will not. So it is, I would suggest, on the basis of this question, who counts as a subject and who does not, that performativity becomes linked with precarity. The performativity of gender has everything to do with who counts as a life, who can be read or understood as a living being, and who lives or tries to live on the far side of established modes of intelligibility. Let me add the following. The life of human life means that it is already connected with what is non-human, and that its connection with non-human life is essential to the life that it is. Let us then hold together this term, human life, even though its component parts, human and life, will never fully coincide with one another. In other words, we will have to hold on to this term, even though, as a term, as a phrase, it will on occasion seek to contain two terms that repel one another or which work in opposite directions. The human can never fully occupy life. Life can never fully explicate the human. So whatever we might want to call existence as a human, living existence as a human, will inevitably consist of a negotiation with this very tension. So as important as it is to ask whose life qualifies as a human life, we also have to ask the inverse question: what of human life is invariably non-human? So the quandary that lies before me is, how do we work in both directions at once? I am not sure, but I begin with formulations such as the following. Even if my life is not destroyed in war, something of my life is destroyed in war. When other lives are destroyed in war. Since life which exceeds me is a condition of who I am, and there is no life